Okay? So let me tick them off for you briefly, and then we'll unpack each in turn. Okay? First, leadership as service. Second, a missionary church. And third, mercy as the most important Christian message at this moment in time. So leadership as service, a missionary church, and mercy as the spiritual cornerstone of this papacy. Okay? So begin with leadership as service. You know, in the early days, and by the early days I mean the first 48 or 72 hours of Francis's papacy, it was, of course, those personal gestures of humility and simplicity that sort of took the world by storm, right? So the fact that when he leaves the Sistine Chapel after the conclave, rather than getting into the chauffeur-driven papal Mercedes limo, he hops onto the shuttle bus with the other cardinals like one of the fellows. Or that when he steps out onto the balcony, before he imposes his blessing on the crowd, he kneels in silent prayer and waits for the crowd to pray for him. The fact that the day after, he goes back to the Casa del Clero, the residence for clergy in Rome where he'd been staying, to pack his own bag and pay his own bill. The fact, now famously, that he decides not to live in the cavernous papal apartment, but to remain in room 201 of the Domus Santa Marta, the hotel on Vatican grounds where the cardinal stayed during the conclave. The fact that he picks up the phone and calls his newspaper delivery guy back in Buenos Aires to say, hey, I'm not going to be coming back, can you please cancel my subscription? And by the way, if I'm Mario Poli, the new Archbishop of Buenos Aires, I'm kind of ticked off about that, because now I got to restart the newspaper and it's a pain in the neck, but, you know, symbolically, it plays great. Now, look, to some extent, you know, all of those gestures just arise naturally from the personality of Jorge Mario Bergoglio. They simply are who the man is. You know, after his election, I went down and spent some time in Buenos Aires doing the backstory of the new pope. I visited the Spartan apartment he lived in for 15 years as the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, rather than living in the Archbishop's palace. And when I describe this place as Spartan, I am not trafficking in euphemism, folks. So this is the kind of place where he had to leave the stove on in the kitchen 24/7 during the winters because the building couldn't afford central heat. Okay, this is where he chose to live. Or, you know, I went down to one of the slugs. In Argentina, they call them the villas miserias, the villas of misery. One of the slums where Bergoglio had founded a parish and sent a couple priests to work there. And I asked one of these pastors, okay, this thing about Bergoglio being the bishop of the slums, is this PR or is this reality? And his answer was, don't take my word for it, go out into the street and ask the folks. So I did. I took my translator and I went out on the street. We stopped 6 or 7 people at random and I said, what can you tell me about the new pope? And you know what they all did? Before they even verbalized their answer, they would run back into the wooden shacks or tin shacks that they called homes, and they would bring out these prized photos showing Bergoglio baptizing their kids, or confirming their nephews, or sitting in their living room when their husband had died, offering them consolation, because that's where he spent his time. Okay. So, I mean, these gestures of humility and simplicity you saw in those early days, they were true to the man's biography and personality. They were not a faux PR exercise. That said, here's one thing you dare never forget about Jorge Mario Bergoglio, about Pope Francis. Beneath that humble, simple exterior lies the mind of an incredibly savvy Jesuit politician. Okay, this Pope knows what he is doing all of the time. So he was quite conscious that those gestures in the early days, and that have continued during the first 14 months of his papacy, those gestures aren't just spontaneous indulgences of his own instincts. They're intended to set a new standard for what leadership in the Catholic Church looks like. Fundamentally, I think what Pope Francis wants is to achieve a kind of Copernican revolution in perceptions. What he wants is that when people look at the symbols of authority in Catholicism, when they look at pectoral crosses, when they look at Roman columns, he wants them instinctively to think in terms of service rather than in terms of power and privilege. Okay? This is not just a journalistic theory. Francis has laid all this out in black and white. On June 22nd, he had an audience with all of the nuncios around the world. These are the papal ambassadors who play lead roles in picking new bishops. And he laid out for them the vision of the kind of leader he wanted them to be looking for. He said on that occasion, and this is his language, what we do not need is a leader who has, and this is his term, the psychology of a prince. Okay? Instead, he said, we want our pastors who carry the smell of their sheep because they are close to the ordinary people that they're called to serve. So that's the blueprint. And we also now know that Francis is willing to take action to back that vision up. And the proof of it comes to us courtesy of the Diocese of Limburg in Germany, which is ground zero for the famous story of the Bling bishop. Did you all hear this story? This is a German bishop by the name of Franz Peter Thebarts von Elst. I mean, just think about the name itself. I mean, Franz Peter Thebarts von Elst. I mean, this kind of reeks of privilege, right? It's too bad because the guy actually comes from a family of poor farmers. But as the story played itself out, the name did not help him. This is the bishop who got into hot water for spending more than $40 million for remodeling the residence that he lives in, including more than $1 million for landscaping, and the most puzzling line item of all, $25,000 for a bathtub. Now, to be honest with you, I'm not even sure what kind of bathtub you can buy for $25,000. When this story broke, I hit a couple of Home Depots. I could not find them. But apparently they exist. When the word of what had happened in Limburg got out, Pope Francis in September dispatched an investigator to the diocese, a very senior Vatican heavy hitter by the name of an Italian by the name of Cardinal Giovanni Loyola. Then in October, he brought both the bishop and the president of the German Bishops' Conference to Rome. He orchestrated a kind of soft landing for this bishop. He gave him an unspecified period of sabbatical outside the diocese. Then in February, the denouement came. He formally accepted this bishop's resignation. And in the meantime, the decision in Limburg is that this remodeled facility is going to become either a center for immigrants and refugees or some kind of a soup kitchen, but in any event, it will no longer be where the bishop lives. Now, in the Catholic universe, this was kind of the shot heard around the world, because what all this communicated is that this language about simplicity in lifestyle and simplicity in leadership is not mere rhetoric, but it's something that the Pope is willing to back up. And he doesn't have to do that kind of thing very often. Because having now changed the expectation level for what people expect from their leaders, in most cases, public opinion will do the work for him. I mean, we saw this in a similar case that just played out in the Archdiocese of Atlanta, where there was a similar kind of outlay of funds, not quite as expensive, but a similar kind of outlay. And at the end of it, the Archbishop Wilton Gregory, having heard the backlash that it generated, agreed to retool the plans. I think collectively what all this says is that the Pope has succeeded in setting a new standard. And look, I mean, we're talking now about bishops because in many ways they are our most visible leaders, but I think the point, as Francis understands it, is much broader than the episcopacy. I think this new standard applies to anyone who exercises authority or plays a visible role of leadership in the Catholic Church. I think the point is he wants them to project a spirit of service, not a spirit of privilege. Final proof of point would be this was the top note of his Christmas speech to members of the Roman Curia. Those are his senior aides in the Vatican. Popes give him a speech every year at Christmas time. It's sort of the Pope's State of the Union address. And Francis's first such speech was devoted entirely to this need for leadership to be based on service. He said, without that, what we become is, again, his language, we become nothing more than a heavy bureaucratic customs house. And he said the world already has plenty of those. Okay. So that's pillar one of the Francis Revolution, an emphasis on leadership as service. All right? 2, a missionary church. You know, popes tend to have a collection of sound bites that become associated with them over time. One of the sound bites that's already become associated with Francis is this drive for the church to get out of the sacristy and into the streets. Out of the sacristy and into the streets. And if you want the more formal statement of that, if you want the charter document, kind of the Magna Carta of Jorge Mario Bergoglio's vision of the Catholic Church in the early 21st century, It's nothing he's written since he's become Pope, although his exhortation, Evangelium Gaudium, comes close. But it's the 2007 Aparecida document of the Latin American bishops. Well, the last time all the bishops of the continent met at the shrine of Our Lady of Aparecida in Brazil, they produced a kind of mission statement. Bergoglio was the lead author of that document, and the top note is the call for a church that relights its missionary fires, that doesn't sit around in the sacristy waiting for people to come to it, but gets out in the streets, meets them where they live, and makes itself relevant to the day-to-day struggles of their lives. So, listen, I mean, I guarantee you that when Francis gets out of bed in the morning, he does not think of himself as a politician. He does not think of himself as a CEO. He does not think of himself as a media darling, although he undeniably is all three of those things. But fundamentally, he understands himself as the missionary-in-chief, the top evangelist of the Catholic Church. Now, if you want to understand how Francis thinks about this idea of a missionary church, I think it has both an individual and a social component, okay? I think the individual component of mission is recognizing the people who are right in front of your face, particularly the broken, wounded, marginalized people who are most in need of a taste of God's love, and providing it to them, not passing them by. So, again, when you see Francis doing things like getting off his Jeep in St. Peter's Square during one of those swings before his audience because he sees a guy who is horribly disfigured by boils off to the side, a guy that most people would walk across the street to avoid, and Francis walks up to him and wraps him in a warm, loving embrace and gives him a kiss. Or when you see Francis inviting a 16-year-old Italian boy with Down syndrome onto the Jeep to take a couple of swings to the square with him. And you see that kid beaming because of the experience. Or when Francis does something like invite 3 homeless guys to join him in the Doma Santa Marta for his birthday breakfast. By the way, footnote to that story, it wasn't just the 3 homeless guys, it was also their dog. Do you know what the dog's name is? Marley, for the reggae icon Bob Marley. I guarantee you this is the first time Bob Marley's name was uttered in the precincts of the Vatican, right? So on the list of firsts in the Francis era, there's another one. Anyway, when you see him doing things like that, these aren't just cutesy PR exercises. They are intended to establish a model for what mission at this individual level looks like. It's about being attentive to the people right in front of you who are most in need of your presence, and then being present to them. Okay? However, there is also a social dimension to Francis's understanding of mission. And here I'd like to say a quick word, because I think there has been something of a misunderstanding about Francis's social agenda. You may know that since he's been elected Pope, Francis has given 5 major sit-down interviews with the media, and they've all kind of been blockbusters. The first came on the papal plane on the way back from Rio de Janeiro to Rome on the 28th of July, when totally out of the blue. I mean, nobody knew this. I was on that flight. Nobody knew this was coming. Okay, he comes back to the press compartment on the way home, and for an hour and 20 minutes, does this completely unscripted, unfiltered, no holds barred back and forth with the press. I mean, let me put it to you this way, okay? And I speak now as a veteran of papal travel. Okay, in many ways, Alitalia Flight 4001 from Rio de Janeiro to Rome on the 28th of July was nothing to write home about. The food was awful, the seats were uncomfortable, but ladies and gentlemen, the in-flight entertainment was spectacular, okay, because the Pope was on his game. And on that occasion, and in many of these other interviews, Francis has made some version of the following. Okay, he said something like, I don't think it's necessary for me to talk so much about issues such as abortion, contraception, and gay marriage, because the teaching of the Church on these matters is already well known, okay? And in some quarters, I think this was taken to mean that the Pope was in some way backing away from the Church's defense of the gospel of life. Folks, take it from me, nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, you know, one proof of the point is that the day after one of these interviews rolled out in late September, the very next day, Francis had an audience with Italian medical personnel in which he gave one of the toughest pro-life speeches you will ever hear a pope give, defining the right to life as the primordial human right and the one upon which all the other rights are based. where Francis routinely lists the unborn when he ticks off this contrast between what he calls a throwaway culture, that is, a culture in which whole categories of people are considered disposable, and a culture of welcome. On January 13th, when he did his first speech to the diplomats accredited to the Vatican, which every year is the Pope's top foreign policy and politics speech, he defined abortion as the most horrific of crimes. So listen, I mean, take it to the bank. This is a robustly pro-life Pope. There will be no retreat or no surrender from the defense of the dignity of human life on his watch. Now, that said, I also believe that Francis thinks that there are some other elements of Catholic social teaching